A billionaire rejected his wife for being poor, but her rise left him begging for another chance. Evelyn Carter had once believed that love could conquer anything. She had thought that her devotion, her unwavering belief in Lucas Blackwood, would be enough to bridge the vast gap between their worlds. But standing at the entrance of the Blackwood estate, staring at the grand doors that led to a mansion that never felt like home, she realized how foolish she had been. The day she married Lucas had been the happiest of her life. Despite the whispers, the judgmental stares, and the quiet warnings from those who claimed to know better, she had stepped into this marriage with hope. He had been her everything, the man who had made her feel seen in a world where she was invisible. But as time passed, she began to wonder if she had ever truly been more than an illusion, a fleeting moment of rebellion in his otherwise calculated life. The Blackwood Mansion was a place of wealth and grandeur, but to Evelyn, it was nothing more than a cold, empty space. Chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, hallways stretched endlessly, and luxury dripped from every corner, but there was no warmth. Servants moved silently, their eyes trained to avoid hers, as if her presence was an inconvenience. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the walls, every carefully selected item spoke of a world she did not belong to. At first, she had tried to fit in. She had learned the etiquette, forced smiles at social gatherings, and pretended not to hear the whispered remarks about how Lucas had married beneath him. She had worn the expensive dresses he provided, walked beside him with her chin high, and convinced herself that love was enough to survive the harsh realities of his world. But love had not been enough. Not when Lucas himself had begun to treat their marriage as nothing more than an obligation. The man she had fallen in love with had been warm, charming, and full of promises. He had whispered reassurances on quiet nights, kissed away her fears, and told her that they would build a life together, no matter what anyone said. But as months passed, those promises faded. Business consumed him, meetings ran late, and his touch grew cold. The distance between them was no longer just emotional. It was a physical wall that he refused to break down. Evelyn tried to reach him, to remind him of the love they had shared. But every attempt was met with indifference. She would wait up for him, hoping for a moment of closeness, only to be met with an exhausted nod before he disappeared into his study. Conversations became brief exchanges, and soon, even those dwindled. The man who had once held her hand in public now walked ahead without looking back. Then came the gala, an event she had dreaded the moment Lucas mentioned it. She had seen the way his mother's lips curled in disapproval, the way his colleagues barely acknowledged her presence at previous gatherings. She had learned, through painful experience, that she was nothing more than an accessory in their eyes, a woman who did not belong. But Lucas had insisted. "It's just one night," he had said, his voice clipped, as if her reluctance was an inconvenience. "You're my wife. You should be there." She should have refused. She should have told him that she was tired of being paraded around like a misplaced ornament, tired of pretending to be something she wasn't. But she had still been that foolish woman who wanted to believe that if she stood by his side long enough, he would remember what they once had. Dressed in an elegant gown she had not chosen, her hair styled to perfection by someone else's hands, she walked into the grand ballroom feeling like an imposter. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of silk and diamonds. Laughter floated through the air, and champagne flowed endlessly. It was a world of power and wealth, a world that had never welcomed her. The whispers started almost immediately. "Is that really Evelyn Carter? I thought she would have learned by now. She still looks out of place, doesn't she? No amount of money can change her. Lucas must regret this marriage. He barely even looks at her." Every word was a dagger, but she swallowed the pain and forced a smile. She turned to Lucas, searching for reassurance, but he was already lost in conversations that did not include her. His colleagues surrounded him, laughing, discussing business, as if she were nothing more than a shadow. She tried to engage, to insert herself into the conversation, but every attempt was met with polite dismissal. And then came the final blow. A woman, elegant, poised, with the confidence of someone who had always belonged, sauntered up to her. Her lips curled into a smirk as she tilted her head in mock sympathy. "It must be exhausting," she mused, swirling the champagne in her glass. "Pretending to belong in a world that was never meant for you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The room around her felt smaller, the air heavier. She turned to Lucas, desperate for him to say something, anything. But he said nothing. He didn't defend her. He didn't refute the cruel words. Instead, he looked away. And in that moment, Evelyn realized the truth. She had never truly belonged. Not in this mansion, not in his world, and not in his heart. Evelyn's heart pounded as silence stretched between them. The woman's smirk deepened, and the surrounding socialites watched with barely concealed amusement, waiting for her reaction. The weight of their judgment pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. But the worst part of it all was Lucas. The man she had once believed would stand by her side, no matter what refused to even meet her eyes. Shame burned through her veins, but she refused to let them see her break. Summoning every ounce of composure she had left, she forced a tight smile. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. She made her way toward the balcony, desperate for fresh air, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of humiliation. The cool night breeze hit her face the moment she stepped outside, but it did little to soothe the ache inside her. She gripped the railing, her knuckles white, as she fought back the tears. How had she let it come to this? She had given everything to this marriage, believing that love would be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. She had endured the whispers, the judgment, the constant feeling of not belonging, all because she had once believed in Lucas's love. But tonight had shattered that illusion. She wasn't just an outsider to his world. She was an inconvenience, a mistake he was too ashamed to acknowledge. The doors behind her opened, and for a fleeting moment, her heart foolishly hoped that Lucas had followed her, that he had finally realized what he had done, that he would wrap his arms around her and tell her that she mattered. But it wasn't Lucas. It was his mother. The formidable Eleanor Blackwood stepped onto the balcony, the click of her heels as sharp and precise as the woman herself. Even in the dim light, she exuded power, her presence commanding attention. Evelyn stiffened, bracing herself for what was coming. "I warned you, didn't I?" Eleanor's voice was calm, almost pitying, but Evelyn knew better than to mistake it for kindness. "From the moment you walked into my son's life, I told you this would never work. And yet here we are." Evelyn remained silent, her nails digging into the cold metal of the railing. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You don't belong here, Evelyn. You never did." She sighed, as if this were all some unfortunate inconvenience, rather than the slow destruction of a marriage. "Lucas's reputation is everything. His future, his legacy, it's bigger than one impulsive mistake." The words cut deeper than they should have. Maybe because, deep down, Evelyn had always feared them to be true. "You think love is enough," Eleanor continued, tilting her head slightly. "But love isn't what makes the world turn, dear. Power does. Influence does. And you have neither." Evelyn swallowed hard, refusing to let Eleanor see the cracks forming inside her. "Is that why he didn't defend me tonight?" she asked quietly. "Because he's ashamed of me?" Eleanor's lips curled into a knowing smile. "My son is a practical man. He understands what's at stake. And tonight, he made his choice." A sharp, bitter laugh bubbled up inside Evelyn before she could stop it. "You mean you made it for him?" Eleanor didn't deny it. Instead, she stepped even closer, lowering her voice. "Leave him, Evelyn, while you still have some dignity left." Evelyn's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. "And if I don't?" Eleanor's smile never faltered, but her eyes turned colder. "Then he'll leave you first." The words echoed in Evelyn's mind long after Eleanor walked away. She stayed on the balcony for what felt like forever, staring at the city lights in the distance, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. When she finally gathered the strength to return inside, The gala was still in full swing. People laughed, sipped their expensive champagne, and whispered behind delicate hands, oblivious to the woman whose world had just crumbled. Lucas stood across the room, speaking with a group of investors, his posture relaxed as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just let her be humiliated, as if he hadn't just broken her heart. Evelyn didn't approach him. She had no more words left to say. That night, she didn't wait up for him. She climbed into bed alone, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the clock ticking away the seconds of a marriage that was already slipping through her fingers. Days passed in an unbearable silence. Lucas barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was with the detached politeness one might use with a stranger. The tension in the mansion was suffocating, and Evelyn felt like a ghost haunting a place that had never truly been hers. Then, one evening, she walked into his study to find a single envelope sitting on his desk. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. She already knew what it was before she even opened it. Divorce papers. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring as she scanned the cold, impersonal document that reduced their marriage to nothing more than legal terms and signatures. The sound of footsteps behind her made her stiffen. She turned slowly to find Lucas standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "This is how it ends." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lucas didn't look at her. "It's for the best." Evelyn let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "For the best," she repeated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Tell me, Lucas, was any of it real?" He hesitated. For the first time in weeks, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt? Regret? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You were never meant to be part of my world," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We both knew that." Evelyn stared at him, searching for the man she had once loved. The man who had held her in his arms and promised her forever. But that man was gone. She placed the papers back on the desk, her hands surprisingly steady. "I hope you get everything you ever wanted, Lucas," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away. She didn't take anything with her. No suitcases, no jewelry, nothing. She walked out of the Blackwood mansion with only the clothes on her back and the shattered pieces of her heart. The night air was cold against her skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was numb, her body moving on autopilot as she walked through the gates, leaving behind the life she had once dreamed of. With every step, the pain pressed down harder, but beneath it, something else stirred. Determination. Evelyn Carter had lost everything, but she refused to remain broken. One day, Lucas Blackwood would regret this. And when that day came, she would no longer be the woman who had once begged for his love. Evelyn walked through the unfamiliar streets, the weight of her reality pressing down on her like an unbearable storm. The cold wind bit through her thin coat, making her shiver, but she kept moving. She had nowhere to go, no home to return to, and no money to get by. The world she once knew had vanished overnight, leaving her lost in a city that felt both enormous and suffocating. The humiliation of being discarded like she was nothing clung to her skin, an invisible stain she couldn't wash away. She had once been the wife of Lucas Blackwood, a name that had carried power, wealth, and security. Now, that name was nothing but a whisper of the past, one that people used to mock her downfall. She entered a small cafe, hoping to escape the brutal cold, and sat at the farthest corner, pretending she was waiting for someone. In truth, she just needed a moment to breathe, to think. Her last bit of cash barely covered the cup of coffee in front of her, and once it was gone, she would have nothing. A group of well-dressed women sat nearby, their laughter light and carefree. Evelyn didn't need to look to know who they were. Socialites who had once fawned over her when she was married to Lucas. "Did you hear?" She walked out with nothing. One of them whispered. She should have known better. A girl like her doesn't belong in that world. She was lucky to even be there in the first place. The words sliced through her like knives, but she kept her head down. There was nothing left to say. When the cafe closed for the night, she found herself wandering aimlessly again. She had never truly understood the weight of loneliness until now. Even in her most difficult days with Lucas, she had at least had a home, a bed to sleep in. Now, she had to figure out how to survive on her own. She found a small motel that charged by the night, using what little she had left to pay for a room. The walls were thin, the sheets rough, and the air stale. But it was better than the streets. She curled up on the bed, pulling the blanket tightly around her, willing herself not to cry. Tomorrow, she would figure out her next move. The next day, she walked into store after store, office after office, searching for any job that would hire her. She had no experience beyond being a billionaire's wife, no references that could help her. Most places didn't even bother looking at her resume before turning her away. By the end of the day, exhaustion dragged at her limbs, but she refused to give up. At a small diner on the edge of town, a tired-looking manager finally gave her a chance. The pay was low, the hours brutal, but it was something. Evelyn worked tirelessly, washing dishes, wiping tables, and serving customers who barely glanced at her. The work was grueling, her hands raw from scrubbing, her feet aching from hours of standing. But it wasn't enough. One job wouldn't cover the rent for long, so she found another, then another. She worked morning shifts at a bakery, night shifts cleaning offices, and the graveyard shift at the diner. She barely slept, barely ate, running on nothing but sheer determination. Everywhere she went, she saw familiar faces, people who had once respected her, now looking at her with either pity or scorn. Some whispered, others laughed outright, relishing in the sight of her downfall. She wanted to scream, to tell them she wasn't broken, that she would rise again. But words meant nothing. Only actions mattered now. One night, after an exhausting shift at the diner, she sat in the tiny room she could barely afford, staring at the ceiling. She had nothing left from her past life, no designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, not even a single reminder of the home she had once shared with Lucas. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was the realization that she had given everything to a man who had never truly valued her. Evelyn gritted her teeth, pushing past the ache. She would not stay in this place forever. She refused to let this be the end of her story. She wiped away the tears that threatened to spill and picked up an old notebook. If she was going to rebuild her life, she needed a plan. She wrote down everything she had learned from her time in Lucas's world, the way people with power moved, the way they spoke, the way they controlled everything around them. She had spent years watching from the sidelines, and now she would use that knowledge for herself. She would not just survive. She would rise. Evelyn didn't know how yet, but she promised herself one thing. The world that had cast her aside would soon know her name again. She closed the notebook, her heart steady, her mind clear. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward something bigger. She had nothing now, but one day, she would have everything. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Evelyn's life was a never-ending cycle of exhaustion, but she refused to break. She woke up before dawn, rushing from one job to another, barely pausing to eat. Her body ached, her hands were rough and calloused, and her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. Yet, no matter how exhausted she was, she never let herself collapse. Because in the quiet hours of the night, when the city slept, she studied. With what little money she had left after rent and food, she bought secondhand business books, filling the gaps in her knowledge. Every lesson Lucas had taught her unintentionally, every observation she had made during their marriage, she used it all. She studied corporate strategies, financial planning, and leadership skills. She memorized business terminologies and analyzed market trends. She knew that power wasn't just about money. It was about knowledge, influence, and strategy. And she would master them all. But survival wasn't easy. Her past haunted her everywhere she went. The socialites who had once invited her to glamorous parties now turned their noses up at her. Former acquaintances pretended not to recognize her. Some of them, the cruelest ones, made sure she knew exactly what they thought of her fall from grace. One evening, after finishing a late shift at the diner, she was cleaning the last table when she overheard two familiar voices near the entrance. Can you believe it? Evelyn Carter, scrubbing floors. Just last year, she was draped in diamonds at the Blackwood mansion. She always looked out of place. Lucas must be relieved to be rid of her. Evelyn gripped the cloth in her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The old Evelyn might have run, humiliated but not anymore. She finished wiping the table, lifted her chin, and walked past them without sparing a glance. She didn't need their validation. She was going to build a name for herself, not as Lucas Blackwood's discarded wife, but as a woman the world would never overlook again. Her opportunity came when she least expected it. At one of her many jobs, she worked as a low-level assistant at a struggling marketing firm. The position was menial, answering calls, scheduling meetings, fetching coffee, but it gave her access to something far more valuable than a paycheck: knowledge. She observed everything: the way deals were made, how clients were handled, and most importantly, how the people at the top controlled everything. She listened, learned, and took mental notes. Then, one afternoon, a critical mistake almost cost the company one of its biggest clients. A senior executive had miscalculated a proposal, and the client was ready to walk away. The office was in chaos, panic written across everyone's faces. Evelyn had been silently watching from her desk, piecing together the numbers in her mind. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. "I think I can fix this." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, a lowly assistant daring to speak up in a crisis. The senior executive scoffed, dismissing her immediately. But the CEO, Nathan Sterling, a sharp-eyed businessman who had built the company from the ground up, studied her with curiosity. "Go on," he said. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart pounding. She laid out a revised proposal, breaking down the numbers and restructuring the deal in a way that benefited both sides. The room remained silent as she finished, tension thick in the air. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Nathan smiled. "Call the client back," he ordered. By the end of the day, the deal was salvaged. The executives celebrated, congratulating themselves on avoiding disaster. But Nathan knew the truth. He called Evelyn into his office. "You're wasted as an assistant," he said, watching her carefully. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. "Life." Nathan chuckled. "Life, huh? Well, whatever it is, it's working." He leaned forward. "Tell me something, Evelyn. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to climb higher?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Then let's see what you're really capable of." That day marked the beginning of something new. Nathan Sterling became her mentor, someone who saw beyond her past and recognized her potential. He didn't hand her success. He made her earn it. He threw her into the deep end, testing her intelligence, her resilience, her ability to handle pressure. There were days when she thought she would break, moments when she doubted herself. But she never quit. She studied harder than ever, absorbing everything Nathan taught her. She learned the art of negotiations, the importance of calculated risks, and the brutal realities of power. She was no longer just surviving. She was evolving. Her rise wasn't immediate. There were setbacks, failures, and sleepless nights filled with frustration. But Evelyn had learned something from her pain. It could either destroy her or fuel her. She chose the latter. By the time a year had passed, she was no longer an assistant fetching coffee. She was an executive, commanding boardrooms, making decisions that impacted entire companies. The people who had once dismissed her now sought her advice. Her name was beginning to echo in elite circles, whispered in admiration and fear. She had become a woman of power. But despite her success, one thing remained unchanged: her fire. She hadn't forgotten the humiliation, the betrayal, the way Lucas had tossed her aside as if she were nothing. He had left her with nothing. But now, she had built something greater than he could ever imagine. She had risen from the ashes, and soon, Lucas Blackwood would realize one thing. The woman he had discarded was no longer the same. And this time, she would be the one standing above him. Lucas Blackwood had always believed he was untouchable. He had built his empire from the ground up, conquering the business world with ruthless precision. Competitors feared him, investors relied on him, and the elite respected him. He had never doubted his position, never considered the possibility of failure. He was Lucas Blackwood, unshakable, invincible. But cracks had begun to form in the foundation of his empire, slow and almost imperceptible at first. Small fluctuations in market shares, minor declines in quarterly earnings, nothing too alarming. Lucas dismissed them as temporary setbacks, the natural ebb and flow of business. He had survived worse, and he would survive this. But as time passed, the cracks widened. Investors grew uneasy. Board members began whispering behind closed doors, questioning decisions they had once followed without hesitation. Competitors, sensing weakness, circled like vultures. Lucas, however, refused to see the signs. He had been at the top for too long, and in his mind, there was no force capable of bringing him down. Temporary setbacks, he told his advisors. This company has survived worse. We'll recover. But the numbers told a different story. Deals he had once secured effortlessly were now slipping through his fingers. Clients who had once trusted his leadership were exploring other options. His once unshakable empire was beginning to tremble under the weight of its own overconfidence. His pride blinded him to the storm brewing just beyond his sight. Then came the name. A new player had entered the industry, a rising powerhouse, making waves in ways no one had expected. At first, it was just a whisper, a name murmured in passing, an ambitious company buying out smaller firms, securing valuable partnerships, subtly yet effectively disrupting the market. Lucas barely paid attention. Another ambitious newcomer trying to carve a place in the world, nothing he hadn't seen before. They would rise, and when the time came, he would crush them. But the whispers grew louder. This wasn't just another startup clawing for recognition. It was a force moving strategically, outmaneuvering him at every turn. His rivals began shifting their attention. Investors who had once been loyal to him were now considering other options. And then, one evening, at a high-stakes meeting, a board member voiced the concern aloud. "We're losing ground, Lucas," the man said, setting a report on the table. "And this company, this new competitor, they're not just anyone. They know exactly how to hit where it hurts. Every move they make is calculated. They aren't just building a business, they're dismantling your control." Lucas scoffed. "Then we fight back." The board exchanged uneasy glances. "We would," another member admitted. "But they aren't making mistakes. They're playing the game too well." Almost as if. The words trailed off, but Lucas caught the hesitation. As if what? The man hesitated, then finally spoke the thought they had all been too afraid to voice. "As if they know you." The words lingered in the air, but Lucas dismissed them. It didn't matter. Whoever they were, they would learn soon enough he didn't lose. The opportunity to crush this unknown rival came sooner than expected. An elite gala was being held in the heart of the city, a gathering of the wealthiest, the most influential, a place where business deals were made over champagne and reputations were solidified. Lucas had no doubt that he would be the center of attention, as he always was. He thrived in such environments, his presence commanding, his name enough to turn heads. But the moment he stepped into the grand ballroom, something felt off. The atmosphere wasn't what he expected. There was a different energy in the air, a shift in focus. He scanned the room, expecting to find the usual admiration, the subtle glances of awe and envy directed toward him. But no, people weren't looking at him. Their attention was drawn elsewhere. Curious murmurs filled the room. Conversations hushed as heads turned in the same direction. Lucas followed their gaze, and then he saw her, Evelyn Carter. But not the Evelyn he had once known. Not the fragile woman who had once clung to him, seeking his approval, desperate for his love. No, the woman before him was a stranger. Dressed in a gown that exuded elegance and power, she moved through the crowd with effortless grace. She held herself with confidence, her presence demanding attention without a single word. The same elites who had once scorned her were now vying for her time, drawn to the sheer force of the woman she had become. Lucas felt his breath catch. This wasn't possible. The Evelyn he had abandoned had nothing. She had walked away from their marriage with empty hands, cast aside like a forgotten shadow. She had been powerless. And yet, the woman standing before him was anything but powerless. His mind raced, struggling to piece together the impossible. How? How had she climbed so high? How had she gone from a discarded wife to a name that commanded attention in a room filled with the most powerful? She hadn't even looked at him yet. And that, somehow, was the hardest thing to accept. Once, her eyes had sought him out in every room. Once, her world had revolved around him. Now, she moved past him as if he were nothing more than a stranger in the crowd. It was in that moment that the weight of his past choices finally caught up with him. Evelyn Carter wasn't just back. She was here to rewrite the game. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood felt something he had never known before. Unease. Because for the first time, he wasn't the one with the power. She was. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, but Lucas barely registered a single moment. The room felt different now, the air heavier, charged with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to humiliation. He had walked in expecting to be the center of attention, but instead, all eyes had turned to her. Evelyn, the woman he had left behind without a second thought. The woman he had assumed would fade into nothing without him. But she hadn't disappeared. She had risen. Lucas clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey in his hand. He forced himself to observe, to study the way the people around her hung onto her every word, the way powerful men and women laughed at her remarks, nodded at her insights, leaned in when she spoke. They respected her. Some even seemed to admire her. And not a single person treated her as the broken, abandoned woman he had once left behind. She was no longer in his shadow. A sick realization settled in his stomach. Evelyn wasn't just here to prove she had survived. She was here to dominate, and she was doing it well. The whispers around the room confirmed what he already feared. Her name was everywhere. Evelyn Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises. A name now spoken in the same breath as the biggest players in the industry. A name that, until tonight, Lucas had been too blind to acknowledge. How had he not seen this coming? For years, he had built his empire with a ruthless hand, believing he was untouchable. Yet here she was, standing in a world he never thought she would belong to, not just as a participant, but as a force to be reckoned with. She had stolen the spotlight. And worse, she didn't even seem to care that he was there. Lucas expected some reaction from her, some sign that his presence affected her. But she didn't falter. Not once. When their eyes finally met across the room, he felt something tighten in his chest. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. There was no warmth, no longing, not even resentment. Only indifference. She wasn't looking at him like the man she had once loved. She was looking at him like a stranger. Lucas exhaled sharply, tearing his eyes away, unwilling to accept the truth gnawing at him. He had expected Evelyn to remain trapped in the past, to carry the burden of their history as he moved on without a second thought. But she had freed herself, and now she was his competition. The realization hit harder than it should have. The next morning, Lucas stepped into his office with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. The image of Evelyn from last night still burned in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the unsettling grip of uncertainty. He needed answers. Everything you can find on Carter Enterprises, he snapped at his assistant, dropping into his chair. Now, the assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Right away, sir. Minutes later, files, reports, and news articles were laid out before him. Lucas scanned through them with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Carter Enterprises had grown at an alarming rate. It wasn't just a rising company. It was a calculated storm, sweeping through the industry with precision. Every move was strategic. Every acquisition, every deal, it was as if someone had mapped out the weaknesses of his empire and targeted them one by one. Someone who knew exactly how to challenge him. His jaw clenched. Evelyn, this wasn't a coincidence. She hadn't just rebuilt herself. She had studied the game. She had studied him. Lucas forced himself to read through the reports carefully, his pulse quickening with every page. She had done what few had dared, stepping into a world dominated by men who once mocked her and proving that she was just as capable, if not more. and the business world had taken notice. Her latest move, a multi-million-dollar deal with an international tech firm, was the final blow. A deal he had been working toward for months, one that should have belonged to Blackwood Industries. But it had slipped through his fingers. Because of her, Lucas inhaled sharply, tossing the report onto his desk. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled together. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to panic. She was winning, and the world was watching. Over the next few weeks, the headlines told a story he could no longer ignore. Carter Enterprises on the rise, a new powerhouse in the corporate world. Evelyn Carter stuns investors with unprecedented growth. Lucas Blackwood faces unexpected competition. Is his reign at risk? Each article felt like a direct hit, a reminder that he was no longer untouchable. Lucas had always believed himself superior, the one in control. But now, the roles were shifting, and he wasn't prepared for it. The invitation came unexpectedly. A high-stakes business summit, attended by the most powerful figures in the industry. The kind of event Lucas had dominated for years. The kind of event where alliances were formed, where power was reaffirmed. And this time, Evelyn Carter was attending. He should have ignored it. He should have acted as if she was nothing more than another name on the list. But he couldn't, because, whether he admitted it or not, he needed to see her again. Lucas arrived at the venue with his usual confidence, his presence commanding the room as it always did. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew this night would be different. Because once again, all eyes weren't on him. They were on her. Evelyn stood near the center of the room, effortlessly engaged in conversation with some of the industry's most influential figures. And just like before, she wasn't looking at him. Lucas clenched his jaw and made his way toward her, each step deliberate, controlled. If she wanted to pretend he was irrelevant, he wouldn't allow it. Evelyn. Her name left his lips like a challenge. For the first time that evening, she turned to face him. And in that moment, Lucas felt something he hadn't expected, the weight of regret. Up close, she was even more striking. Gone was the woman who had once softened at his touch, who had looked at him with unguarded love. She didn't just look different. She was different. He had been a fool to underestimate her. But the worst part? He had been a fool to let her go. Lucas sat in his office, staring at his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had never hesitated before. Not in business, not in life. But now, doubt curled around him like a thick fog, suffocating and relentless. He had spent years walking away from things without a second thought. He had never looked back. Until now. Evelyn's name was still saved in his contacts, untouched for years. It was strange how something so simple, a name on a screen, could hold so much weight. He typed out a message, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. What was he even trying to say? That he missed her? That he wanted to talk? That he regretted everything? The words felt meaningless, empty, too little, too late. But the ache in his chest refused to fade. Finally, he forced himself to type something. Short, simple, direct. He hit send before he could change his mind. No response. Hours passed. Then a day. Then two. Silence stretched between them, cold and unforgiving. Lucas told himself he didn't care, that he had only sent the message out of curiosity. But the truth gnawed at him, an unfamiliar, unwelcome feeling creeping in. She wasn't ignoring him out of anger. She simply didn't care. He wasn't used to this. He had built his life around control, around certainty. If he wanted something, he took it. If he lost something, he replaced it. But Evelyn wasn't something he could just reach for and expect to find waiting. The next time he sent a message, it was a little longer. Still nothing. Lucas found himself scanning through articles, headlines, anything that mentioned her name. She was everywhere now. Business deals, charity events, interviews. People spoke of her with admiration, with respect. And the more he read, the more he realized how little he knew about the woman she had become. But there was one thing he did know. He had to see her. The gala was the perfect opportunity. Exclusive, high profile, the kind of event where power was displayed like jewelry. He had always belonged in places like this. But as he stepped inside, something felt off. The air was different. The eyes that once turned toward him with admiration now held something else, something unreadable. And then he saw her. Evelyn stood near the center of the room, poised and radiant, a vision of effortless elegance. She wasn't just present, she was the center of it all. People leaned in when she spoke, laughed at her words, sought her attention. She was no longer the woman standing in his shadow. Lucas moved toward her, but before he could get close, another man stepped in. Tall, confident, familiar, a powerful investor. Lucas had done business with him before, and now, that same man was smiling at Evelyn like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Something inside him twisted. He hadn't expected this. He had prepared for her to be cold, for her to be distant. But he hadn't prepared for her to have moved on, to belong in a world where he was no longer needed. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. She had been his once. She had loved him in a way no one else ever had, and he had let her go without a second thought. Now, she didn't even look his way. Lucas clenched his jaw and turned away, retreating into the crowd, his fists tightening at his sides. He had always believed he was in control, that if he ever wanted her back, it would be easy. But Evelyn wasn't waiting for him anymore. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Blackwood felt like he was losing something he couldn't afford to lose. Lucas stormed out of the gala, his breath uneven, his mind racing. He had come expecting distance, maybe even resentment, but he hadn't expected indifference. That was what shook him the most. The way Evelyn had barely acknowledged his presence, the way she had smiled so easily at another man while looking straight through him. He climbed into the back seat of his car and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions, but Lucas said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. He should have seen this coming. He had been a fool to think he could just send a few messages, show up at a party, and have things go back to the way they were. Evelyn had changed. She had become untouchable, unreachable, and yet he couldn't accept it. The following days were a blur of distraction and frustration. He buried himself in work, attending endless meetings, reviewing financial reports, but nothing held his focus. He found himself staring at his phone more often than he cared to admit, checking for a reply that never came. It wasn't just about getting a response anymore. It was about something deeper, something raw and unsettling. Regret. It gnawed at him, clawing at his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. In the quiet of his office late at night, during business dinners where the conversation felt empty. In the morning, when he woke up alone in his penthouse, the space around him cold and lifeless. His mind drifted back to the past, to the life he had once shared with Evelyn. He had been so focused on building his empire, on proving himself to the world, that he never realized what he was throwing away. He had taken her love for granted, assuming it would always be there. But love wasn't something you could neglect and expect to last. He remembered the way she used to wait up for him, her eyes filled with silent hope, only for him to come home hours late, barely sparing her a glance. He remembered the quiet dinners, the way she would reach for his hand, only for him to pull away without thinking. And he remembered the last time he saw her, the pain in her voice when she had asked him if he still loved her. He had hesitated. That hesitation had destroyed everything. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Lucas drove to Evelyn's estate. The gates loomed ahead, an impenetrable barrier between them. He had expected her to move on, but seeing her whirl from the outside made it real in a way that shook him to his core. The house was stunning, grand, but not cold, the kind of place that felt like a home. Lights glowed from inside, laughter drifting through the windows. She wasn't alone. Lucas clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had no right to be here, no right to intrude on a life that no longer included him. But before he could drive away, the front door opened, and Evelyn stepped out. His breath caught in his throat. She didn't see him. She was focused on the man standing beside her, the same investor from a gala. They spoke quietly, the conversation easy, familiar. Then she laughed, soft and genuine, the kind of laughter that Lucas hadn't heard from her in years. Something inside him cracked. He had lost her. It was one thing to realize she had changed. It was another to see her happy without him. And yet, as much as it hurt, he couldn't blame her. He had been the one to walk away. He had been the one to throw away something rare and irreplaceable. For the first time in his life, Lucas faced the truth. He hadn't just lost Evelyn. He had never deserved her in the first place. The weight of that realization crushed him. He had spent years believing he had everything. But now, standing on the outside of her life, he saw how empty his world truly was. And he knew, with devastating certainty, that an apology wouldn't be enough. Words wouldn't erase the past. If he wanted even a chance at redemption, he would have to prove, through actions, not promises, that he was a man worthy of her forgiveness. Even if it meant losing everything he had worked for. Even if it meant changing for reasons beyond just winning her back. Because for the first time, Lucas Blackwood understood what love truly meant. And he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Lucas sat in his empty office, staring out at the skyline he had once ruled. The city stretched before him, glittering with the wealth and power he had spent his life chasing. But for the first time, it all felt meaningless. The towering buildings, the lucrative deals, the endless cycle of ambition. It had once defined him, but now it only reminded him of everything he had lost. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. His empire had given him everything except the one thing that truly mattered. Evelyn. Her name echoed in his mind, a ghost of the past that refused to fade. He had spent years believing that success required sacrifice, that love was a weakness he couldn't afford. But now, stripped of the illusions he once clung to, he saw the truth. He had been wrong. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant entered, holding a stack of documents. "Mr. Blackwood, the board is waiting for you to sign the new expansion deal." Lucas glanced at the papers. A billion-dollar project. Another step toward dominance in the industry. It was everything he had worked for, everything his past self would have signed without hesitation. But instead of reaching for the pen, he found himself staring at the contract, unmoving. His assistant hesitated. "Sir," Lucas exhaled slowly. "Cancel it." The woman's eyes widened. "Cancel? I'm stepping down." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but the weight that lifted from his chest told him it was the right decision. "Sir, are you sure? This company will survive without me," he finished. "But I won't survive if I keep living like this." For the first time in years, he turned his back on the corporate empire he had built. He walked away from the ruthless ambition that had cost him everything. The world would call him insane for giving up his throne, but Lucas didn't care. He was done chasing power. Now, he was chasing redemption. The weeks that followed were a blur of change. He liquidated assets, redirected funds, and made decisions that left the business world stunned. Instead of expanding his empire, he funneled his wealth into charities, building homes for the homeless, funding education programs, and investing in causes that actually mattered. He spent his days in places he had once ignored, shelters, community centers, hospitals, seeing firsthand the impact of a life not driven by greed. For the first time, he understood the weight of his past. He had spent years valuing profits over people, closing deals while turning a blind eye to those who suffered. He had been ruthless, untouchable, unbothered. But now, stripped of his arrogance, he saw his empire for what it truly was, a castle built on selfishness. One afternoon, he stood in a youth center he had funded, watching children laugh and play. A boy no older than 10 tugged on his sleeve. "Mister, are you the one who built this place?" Lucas hesitated before nodding. The boy grinned. "Thanks. My little sister finally has somewhere safe to play." Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. This was a different kind of success. Not numbers on a balance sheet. Not stock values or corporate takeovers. This was real. But even as he changed, even as he built something meaningful, there was one thing missing. Evelyn. He had done all of this for himself, for his own redemption. But deep down, he couldn't shake the hope that one day she would see him for the man he had become. That maybe, just maybe, he could prove he wasn't the same Lucas Blackwood who had once shattered her heart. And yet, he didn't deserve to ask for her forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that didn't stop him from hoping. Lucas had spent years controlling everything: his business, his image, his relationships. But now he was learning the hardest lesson of all. Some things could never be forced. Evelyn had been the one thing in his life he had always taken for granted, believing she would always be there, waiting in the shadows, enduring his neglect. But when he finally turned around, she was gone, and no amount of wealth, power, or regret could bring her back. Still, he couldn't shake the hope that one day she would see him, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was trying to become. That hope kept him moving, pushing forward even when doubt crept in. He didn't reach out to her. Not yet. Instead, he focused on proving to himself that this change was real. Weeks turned into months. The headlines called him unpredictable, reckless, insane. Billionaire turns his back on corporate throne. Lucas Blackwood's fortune poured into charity. Industry titan walks away. Midlife crisis or redemption. He ignored the noise. The media could speculate all they wanted. The only opinion that mattered to him was hers. He first saw Evelyn again at a gala, a charity event for a foundation she had built from the ground up. She looked radiant, standing at the center of the crowd, commanding attention without even trying. Gone was the quiet, uncertain woman who had once lived in a shadow. Now, she was powerful in her own right, a force to be reckoned with. Lucas stood at the edge of the room, watching her from a distance. She was smiling, laughing with a group of influential figures who hung on her every word. He knew that once. He had been the center of her world. But not anymore. She had moved forward without him. His presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the room as people recognized him. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical. And then Evelyn turned. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded. There was no hatred in her gaze, no anger. But there was also no warmth. No flicker of the love that had once burned so fiercely between them. She gave him a polite nod. Nothing more. Then she turned back to her conversation, as if he was just another face in the crowd. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. She had let go, and he was still holding on. Lucas left the event without saying a word to her. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure he ever would be. Because for all his change, for all his efforts, he knew that Evelyn owed him nothing. She had suffered because of him. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of what he had destroyed. And if she never forgave him, if she never let him back in, he would have to live with that. But fate had other plans. Days later, their paths crossed again. It was at a shelter he had been funding, a place for women starting over after escaping difficult circumstances. He had come for a routine visit to check on the progress of the programs he had set in motion. What he hadn't expected was to find Evelyn there. She was speaking with a woman, her voice soft but firm, filled with understanding. She didn't see him at first, too focused on the person in front of her. And as he stood there, watching her, he felt something stir deep inside him. This was the woman he had once overlooked, the woman he had treated as a mere afterthought while he pursued his ambitions. But she was so much more than he had ever given her credit for. She was strong, compassionate, and determined to make a difference. And the most painful truth of all was that she had always been this way. He had just been too blind to see it. When she finally noticed him, there was no shock on her face. No surprise, just quiet acknowledgement. "You're the last person I expected to see here," she said, her tone neutral. Lucas took a step forward, uncertain for the first time in his life. "I could say the same about you." She crossed her arms, studying him. "I've been involved with this shelter for years, long before it was part of your latest initiative." He flinched at the implication. He deserved that. "I'm not here for publicity," he said quietly. "I'm here because I want to be." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to the woman she had been helping, offering her a reassuring smile before excusing herself. Then, she faced him fully. "I read about what you've been doing," she admitted. "I didn't believe it at first." Lucas swallowed hard. "Do you believe it now?" Evelyn hesitated. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer he had wanted, but it was an honest one, and it was more than he deserved. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "Not forgiveness, not a second chance. I need you to know that I'm trying." She held his gaze, and, for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, exposed. Because this wasn't a business deal. There was no strategy, no power play. There was only truth. Finally, she exhaled. Keep trying, Lucas. For yourself. Not for me. Then she walked away. And for the first time, he felt something close to hope. Lucas had always been a man who thrived on control. But now, for the first time in his life, he had none. He couldn't force Evelyn to believe in him. He couldn't demand a place in her life. The only thing he could do was continue on this path, hoping that one day she might see him as something more than the man who had once broken her. He spent the following months pushing himself, immersing in work that felt meaningful for the first time in his life. His corporate empire ran without him. His former board members still trying to understand why a man with everything had willingly walked away. But Lucas no longer cared about their opinions. He had spent his entire life chasing a legacy of power. Now, he wanted something real. His philanthropic projects grew, but he kept a low profile. No interviews, no speeches, no grand public appearances. He wasn't doing this to be praised. He was doing it because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. He poured his energy into helping those who had been discarded, just as he had once discarded Evelyn. Despite everything, their paths continued to cross. Not by design, but by the nature of the world they had both stepped into. It was at a fundraiser for women's education that he saw her next. She was speaking passionately about the importance of financial independence, about giving women opportunities beyond survival. He listened, mesmerized, realizing how little he had truly known about her even when they had been together. When the event ended, he found her outside, standing near her car. For a moment, he considered walking away, but something inside him urged him forward. She didn't seem surprised when he approached. Lucas, Evelyn. He nodded, his voice steady. Your speech was incredible. She studied him carefully. Thank you. He hesitated before speaking again. I've been following the work you've been doing. It's inspiring. She let out a soft breath. I didn't do it to inspire anyone. I know, he said. That's what makes it real. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Lucas had never been a man of patience, but he had learned that this was not a situation he could rush. He had spent years making mistakes. He could not undo them in a single conversation. Evelyn finally broke the silence. You're different now. He swallowed. I'm trying to be. Her gaze remained unreadable. But why, Lucas? Why now? He had asked himself that same question many times. The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. Because I had everything, he said finally, and I still felt empty. Because I spent years convincing myself that love was a weakness, only to realize that pushing you away was the weakest thing I've ever done. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. He couldn't tell if it was hope or something else entirely. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I know, he said, his voice quiet. And I'll never ask you to. That's something only you can decide. Evelyn nodded slowly, then looked past him. I should go. Lucas stepped back, giving her space. Good night, Evelyn. She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away immediately either. For a brief moment, it felt like there was something left unsaid between them. And then, she turned and left. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Lucas continued his work, but there was an ache in his chest he couldn't ignore. Evelyn had seen his efforts, acknowledged his change, but was it enough? One evening, he found himself standing outside the very building where he had first destroyed everything, the penthouse they had once shared. He had moved out long ago, unable to bear the ghosts that lingered there. But tonight, the memories hit him harder than usual. He could still see her standing on that balcony, waiting for him to come home, waiting for a man who had never truly been there. He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. He had spent his entire life making decisions, choosing what he thought was best for himself. But for once, the choice was not his to make. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. Lucas! His heart stopped. He turned, and there she was. Evelyn stood just a few feet away, wearing an expression he couldn't quite read. He blinked, convinced he was imagining her. Evelyn. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady. I wasn't planning on coming here. I don't even know why I did. Lucas swallowed. I'm glad you did. She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no amusement in it. You think I don't see it, don't you? He frowned. See what? The way you've changed, she said. I see it, Lucas. I see everything, and I don't know what to do with it. He took a cautious step forward. You don't have to do anything. I told you. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I just want you to know that I will never make the same mistakes again. Evelyn looked away, her expression troubled. I used to dream about this, you know? That one day, you'd wake up and realize what you had lost. Lucas's chest tightened. And now, she met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something raw in her eyes. Now I'm afraid that if I let myself believe it, I'll get hurt all over again. He wanted to tell her that she wouldn't, that he would spend every day proving that he was a different man. But he knew words meant nothing. So instead, he simply said, then I'll wait. Evelyn searched his face, as if trying to see if he truly meant it. And then, after a long silence, she nodded. Lucas exhaled, feeling something shift between them. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Maybe it wasn't love. But it was hope. And for now, that was enough. Lucas had never been good at waiting. Patience was a virtue he had never bothered to cultivate. In business, in life, he took what he wanted and didn't waste time questioning whether it was rightfully his. But with Evelyn, he had no choice. He couldn't force her to love him again. He couldn't erase the past. All he could do was continue on his path and hope that, in time, she would see him as more than just the man who had once broken her. He stayed away, not because he wanted to, but because he knew she needed space. She had spent years rebuilding herself after he had shattered her, and he refused to be the reason she wavered now. Instead, he focused on his work. His foundation grew, expanding into projects that genuinely made a difference. He worked late into the night, not for profit, but because it was the only thing that kept him from thinking about her. Still, Evelyn was never far from his mind. He saw her name in articles, heard about her from mutual acquaintances. She had become a force of her own, commanding respect in a world that had once dismissed her. And then, fate intervened. It was a stormy evening when he found himself face to face with her again. He hadn't expected to see her there, at a small charity event held at one of the community centers his foundation had funded. But there she was, standing near the entrance, listening to one of the volunteers talk. His heart clenched at the sight of her. She was wearing a navy blue dress, simple yet elegant, and for a brief moment, it reminded him of a time long ago, when she had been his wife, when he had failed to see the woman standing beside him. She noticed him almost immediately, her gaze flickering with something unreadable before she turned back to the conversation. Lucas hesitated. He could leave, avoid putting her in an uncomfortable position. But something about the way she had looked at him, something in her eyes, kept him rooted in place. So he stayed. Throughout the evening, he caught glimpses of her, but neither of them approached the other. It wasn't until much later, when most of the guests had left, that she finally walked toward him. "You've been avoiding me," she said, her tone light, but laced with something deeper. Lucas exhaled. "I thought you needed space." She tilted her head slightly. "And now?" He studied her, searching for an answer. "I don't know. I don't want to be the reason you doubt yourself, Evelyn." A flicker of something crossed her face. "And if I'm the one who came looking for you?" His breath hitched. He hadn't expected that. "Then I'd ask you why." Evelyn looked away for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "Because I don't know how to stop feeling like you're part of my story." Lucas's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that she didn't have to fight it, that whatever they had been, was still there, waiting. But he couldn't say that. Instead, he said, "Then tell me what you need from me." Evelyn was silent for a long moment. And then, finally, she said, "Time." Lucas nodded, accepting it for what it was. A chance. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time, they weren't strangers orbiting each other from a distance. They didn't rush into anything. They met for coffee, had long conversations, shared silences that no longer felt heavy with pain. And through it all, Lucas never pushed. He never asked for more than she was willing to give. One evening, they found themselves walking along the riverfront. It was late, the city lights reflecting on the water, the air thick with the quiet hum of life around them. I used to think love was a transaction, Lucas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That if I gave enough, I would get what I wanted. Evelyn glanced at him. And now, he let out a slow breath. Now I know that love isn't about taking. It's about giving, even if you get nothing in return. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out, hesitantly at first, before slipping her hand into his. It was the smallest of gestures, but to Lucas, it felt like the world shifting. He didn't say anything. He simply held on, knowing that, for the first time, they were walking towards something real. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments, late-night phone calls, shared laughter, and unspoken emotions. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One evening, Lucas received an unexpected call. "I want to show you something," Evelyn said. An hour later, he found himself outside a small house on the outskirts of the city. He had expected something grand, something reflective of the success she had built. Instead, it was simple, warm. A home. She led him inside, her expression unreadable. "This is where I go when I need to breathe." Lucas looked around, taking in the space. It was nothing like the world they had once shared, nothing like the cold walls of their past. "This is beautiful," he said. Evelyn exhaled. "I bought this place because I wanted to prove to myself that I could stand on my own." Lucas swallowed, understanding the weight of her words. "And have you?" She met his gaze. "Yes, but standing alone doesn't mean I have to be alone." Something inside him cracked open. This was it. Not a promise, not a declaration of love, but an understanding, a chance to rebuild. He took a step closer. "Then let's figure out what this means. Together." Evelyn didn't hesitate this time. She reached for him, closing the distance between them. And in that moment, Lucas knew, this time it was different. This time, love wasn't about control or obligation. It was about choice, and she was choosing him. Time passed, but this time wasn't slipping through their fingers. It was building something new, something neither of them had ever known before. Their love had been reborn, not from desperation or regret, but from patience, respect, and an unspoken understanding that they were no longer the people they once were. Evelyn no longer feared losing herself in Lucas's world, and Lucas no longer saw love as something to be owned. They moved forward, not as a man trying to reclaim what he had lost or a woman trying to protect her heart, but as equals, hand in hand, side by side. One evening, as they stood beneath the stars, Lucas looked at her and smiled, not with the arrogance of a man who had conquered, but with the quiet gratitude of a man who had been given another chance. "There are no contracts this time," he murmured. Evelyn nodded. "No power struggles. No expectations," he added. "Just us," she whispered. And for the first time, love wasn't a battle. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't something that needed to be proven or earned. It simply was. This time, it was real. This time, it would last. For